3 higher ed authors, 100 plus college and university presidents, dozens of actionable insights for academic leaders. Commencement, the beginning of a new era in higher education, is now available on Amazon.
Welcome back, everybody. It's your time to EdUp on the EdUp Experience podcast, where we make education your business. You knew that's what I was going to say because you've heard me say it around 600 and something times, and it gets better every time I say it because, well, it's getting out there, and we're talking about lifelong learning and the importance of talking about higher education in a positive way. For those in and around higher ed, the importance of teaching and learning and providing educational pathways for students. This is what we do, so we need to talk about it. And by the way, those pathways can come in many, many forms, and those forms seem to be taking even more forms. Did that make any sense? I don't know. That can be a rhetorical question. But here comes ChatGPT, here comes artificial intelligence, and the pathways explode and expand every single day. In fact, one of my best tips that I can make for anybody listening to this podcast is to spend 15 minutes a day, just 15 minutes. Pick one of the AI tools that's out there that you hear about and go check it out. Some of these AI tools can do pretty crazy things that'll blow your mind. In fact, you could ask ChatGPT what AI programs you should look at, and it will tell you. That's how cool AI tools are getting. Next thing you know, you'll be using AI in a way you never thought before. It'll help you do work. It can help you plan better in your classroom. It can help you with teaching and learning. It can help you understand what's happening in higher education, how we can better use higher ed and talk about our value proposition. In fact, there's so much. That's it for my monologue today. And of course, follow the data. You gotta follow data. Hint, hint. That's for a hint for when I bring in my guest, and it'll make more sense when I do. But before I do, I'm going to bring in my guest co-host, who was previously a guest, and now she's back here. Ladies and gentlemen, we have Dr. Melody Rose, and she's a principal at Whitkeefer. Melanie, what's going on?
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be back on the show, and I'm really excited about our guest.
Oh, you know what, Melanie? You did not make the rookie mistake. So whenever I have guests come back, and previous guests come back as guest co-hosts, a lot of times they reveal my guest before I get a chance to do so. But you didn't do that. Thank you very much. And right now, I want to bring in our guest because she's got a lot to say and she's got a lot of data to bring to the table. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephanie Marken. She's a partner at Gallup. Stephanie, what's going on?
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Stephanie, did you know it was going to get this crazy already before we barely even started? Yikes!
There'd be this many sound effects. It's really made for an even better podcast experience.
Oh, Stephanie, you're in for it because it hasn't even started yet here on the EdUp Experience podcast. But before we get going, I want to find out about Gallup. So explain Gallup, the organization, to us like we've never heard about Gallup before. What is it that Gallup does? How do you do it? And tell us a little bit about your role as well.
Yeah, so Gallup is a polling firm. We're an analytics and advice company. Our mission is really simple. It's to help people be heard. We take a lot of pride in the people that we interview and the confidence and trust that they put in us in that interviewing process. And of course, that brings us to many higher education institutions where we're interviewing students, faculty, staff, administrators, and also to the general public where we're asking U.S. citizens a series of questions about their attitudes towards post-secondary education, their experiences with post-secondary education if they've enrolled before. So we really have the pleasure of interviewing hundreds of thousands of individuals each year who have in some way experienced or touched or interacted with or considered a post-secondary experience. And we ask them a series of questions about why they've considered it, what their experience was with that particular institution, and what it would take to get them back enrolled again.
Stephanie, thanks. There's a lot in there that you just talked about. And I want to pick out a word, the attitude towards higher education, because it is fluctuating, isn't it? You have all these stats kind of going on in your brain from your work at Gallup. And it comes down to this issue that's really, I think, the central issue, which is the value conversation. It used to be, you go back just a little bit, it was debt, it was cost, and those things still exist, accessibility, all those things exist, but it's relevance right now, and AI is putting that into question, skill stacking. What is the value of a higher education degree specifically? Can you talk a little bit about the attitudes towards higher ed from your work?
Yeah, attitudes towards post-secondary education in the US are fascinating because a lot of people assume, I think, that they've shifted even more so than they have. Now, that's not to say there hasn't been a change in overall attitudes towards post-secondary education. We do see, for example, that people are less confident than they used to be in the institution of higher education in general. Now, of course, that's consistent with all trends in the US, where people are more anti-institution and less trusting of large institutions in general. But in the case of higher education, we've seen a significant drop in confidence, particularly among conservative US adults. However, we also see that a growing number of US adults still believe that post-secondary education provides a better and surer path to a great job and a great life. So it's a little counterintuitive and counter to sometimes the narrative we see in mainstream media where people say, is college worth it or not? Most Americans feel like, yes, college is a sure path to a better job or a better life, and yet they feel like it's inaccessible to them and to their family members. And in many cases it is, right? Because we know post-secondary education is incredibly expensive. It's been increasing in cost relative to inflation at a rate that's unimaginable for most Americans. And so a big concern that many of the individuals for whom we interview express is that they feel like it's an elite system. It's a system that is reserved for individuals who are high income and who've experienced post-secondary education at some point before in their family. First-gen college students who are historically marginalized and underrepresented in higher education are increasingly believing that it's a system really reserved for others and not for them. And that's the problem we're seeing as it relates to public opinion. It's not necessarily they don't see value in post-secondary education. They just feel like it's an exclusive experience that isn't available to people like them.
Oh, wow. You know what? Hearing that is hard. It actually kind of gets you right in the gut, right? I mean, we get it. And, someone like Melody, who's always at the bleeding edge of what's happening in higher education. Now, we get it. It makes sense. But for the greater higher education community, it's hard to hear something like that higher ed is for the elites and then it's not accessible because, well, that's not what we do every single day to make it more accessible, to bring higher education to more people. What's missing? What's the gap?
Well, I think it's a few things. I mean, varsity blues did not help on this issue, right? Because people saw a very mainstream scandal that they felt like really symbolized the problem with post-secondary education in the US, that these few elite institutions were really behaving in a terrible way. And I believe that really represented the greater ecosystem of post-secondary education, which isn't true, right? There's so many different pathways available now to post-secondary learners in the US. You could obtain a certificate, a certification. You could go to a boot camp program. You could do a 2-year degree at very little to no cost within most states in the US. You could obtain a 4-year degree at a flagship or another public institution in your state, again, at very little cost. Unfortunately, when we talk about higher education in the US, especially in mainstream media, we think about a traditional 4-year degree granting institution that's more selective, highly expensive, and is less accessible to the average American. What we're not often talking about is that public flagship in somebody's state that is actually incredibly financially accessible and offers a tremendous amount of aid to individual students who meet certain income thresholds. So I think the problem is there's this disconnect. Most people believe that post-secondary education looks like that 4-year, highly selective, highly expensive degree granting experience. They don't necessarily think about a fully online program that might provide a high quality experience, allow them to upskill and reskill at their own pace in a competency-based education model that doesn't necessarily require them to be a quote button a C to the traditional, campus experience. So we have to do a better job of communicating all of the different pathways that are available to students. It's not just a 4-year degree. These other pathways are actually incredibly accessible, and there are many of them that are made financially available to students for this exact reason.
So Stephanie, I am a first-generation college student myself, and I went to a public university in my home state, and that made it accessible and affordable for me and my family. So I'm curious about how we got here. Tell us more about the erosion of trust, particularly in the higher education space. And you mentioned the varsity blues, but say more about how we got to this place of mistrust.
Well, I was a first generation college student like you, Melody, and I went to an institution at Elon University that made higher education really accessible to me. It was offered at a more affordable price point. They offered me financial aid to make it available. And I just never, I I never take that for granted. I think in my new position and looking at the experience most students have, not only did I have a high quality experience, but I had an affordable and accessible experience. I was able to pay back my student loans in a reasonable amount of time. And I think many people are doing that calculation right now. They're thinking, how long will it take for me to pay back my student loans? Over what time period? At what opportunity cost, right? Because now you're also forcing me to give up my current job, and I'm taking on a tremendous amount of emotional and financial stress in order to obtain this degree. So I think there's this really complex calculus actually most Americans are going through on a day-to-day basis. But
it's fuzzy math
on the issue of communication and trust. I think a key way in which we've lost a lot of prospective learners is how we communicate the financial responsibilities of a post-secondary degree. If you go to a typical website for X 4-year degree institution, you'll find the average cost of attendance for most students attending that institution, and it's incredibly high. What most people don't realize, of course, when they're looking at the cost of tuition or fees at that institution, is a lot of students will qualify for rather significant aid. We know that discounting and additional scholarships made available to students will make that institution more accessible to most students attending it. But if you're a prospective learner and you're just looking at that total sticker value, it's incredibly intimidating. And we know a lot of students are counting themselves out of institutions that do have great financial aid available within the school that will offer those scholarships to students upon admission. But those students aren't even applying because they just see this really high sticker price, and it's really intimidating and keeping them from actually considering that institution. So we're missing out on this amazing group of talented individuals who are first-gen students, lower income students, students who are maybe historically marginalized and underrepresented in higher education in general, because of the way in which we communicate price. So I think we have to do a better job of explaining what the cost of attendance really is to an average American, and also communicating that to their parents and their family members so that they can take on that shared risk at the same time that learner is.
You know what's fascinating about what you just said? So if you're a consumer and you're going to go buy a car, it's natural that you're going to take out a loan, right? You're going to take out a loan for that car. That's just what you do. And it used to be that in higher education, we all understood that we would go take out a loan to get our higher education. And at some point along the way, that became not a thing anymore. Like you aren't going to take loans to get your education because the ROI wasn't clear for a lot of people. So then it was, I'm not taking out a loan, or should I even think about taking out a loan? Shouldn't higher ed be a public good rather than a private commodity? And it creates that whole conversation about what is the purpose of higher education. But it all comes down to the ROI and the finance is, and should ROI be purely a financial calculation? And should higher ed be more than that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's such a good point. I mean, calculating the return of investment for a post-secondary credential is so complicated for so many reasons. I mean, we know that many people have to take on a post-secondary degree in order to work in a high mission, highly important job like being a nurse or being a social worker in the US, right? And so we know also, and teachers too, right? Those are 3 examples of core, critically important jobs and occupations that we all need within our society. And I think we've grown to really appreciate over the course of the last few years in particular, when they kind of kept us all going. So 3 critical roles and occupations within our workforce. Many of them require some post-secondary training. Of course, the more advanced you can get, probably the even better within that individual industry. And yet, if you looked at earnings alone for those 3 categories of occupations, you'd say, is it worth it? Well, yes, of course it's worth it, especially if you're that highly engaged teacher who finds incredible fulfillment in interacting with students and helping them learn and creating more engaged and informed citizenry long-term for entire society to keep turning. But that ROI calculation looks very different than somebody who obtained a law degree. Now, is that lawyer more valuable than that teacher? Of course not. We want both in our society to keep functioning. We need each of them. So we have to make sure that we're not just calculating return on investment based on earnings alone. I think this is where there's a lot of experimentation and work to be done. How do you calculate the return on investment? How do you consider things like well-being and engagement in work? We know, for example, that people who are currently launching into their career and early on, when we ask them what makes a good job, they say that purpose and pay are equally important. So if we're going to create people who have engaging work that they find deep purpose in, we have to remember that that's just as important as them earning a living wage. Now, of course, people have to be able to pay off their student loans long term. It's ridiculous to consider that they might even be in a situation in which that's not possible. But they also have to love what they do, and they also have to be working in a field that creates value within our economy and within our society in order for us to be successful as a country. So we have to think a little more, I think, nuanced in how we describe value. It can't just be return on investment is how much you earn over the course of your life. Although, of course, if you have a bachelor's degree, you're going to earn more than somebody with just a high school degree alone. But we have to talk in a more complicated way about it. It can't just be earnings.
So I'm curious about this ROI question, Stephanie, and you're making a really interesting point about how to nuance it, because I think we talk about it in terms of what are the individual benefits to the degree holder. And I'm curious what we know from the work at Gallup about what the social benefits of an educated society are. And you started to touch on some of those, but I wonder if you might elaborate. If you have kids, if you don't have kids, don't we all have a reason? Isn't there a social benefit to us having a civil society with an education?
Absolutely. So I guess the question you're asking is education for what? What is the outcome, right? Is it for the individual? Is it for society? I would argue it's for both, that both are incredibly important to how we think about post-secondary education. I mean, that's why, for example, we have a system in which we pay for K-12 education, right? Because we have said as a society, it is important for people to be educated, informed citizens long-term for us to continue to function. And I would argue it's the same thing at the post-secondary level, right? We know that people who are educated have higher levels of well-being. They experience lower levels of healthcare costs than their counterparts. They're also more likely to vote and be engaged in their local communities. We've actually done some interesting research in partnership with Lumina Foundation about this that will be released in the coming months that shows Americans are generally pretty positive that education, advanced education beyond high school, that is, does provide all these very important outcomes.
Amazing.
Why aren't they enrolling at a higher rate, right? Isn't that the natural next step? Why aren't people jumping into the post-secondary system? And then I would bring us back to all the things that we just discussed, right? The total cost of attendance feels too high, too significant. And people are also experiencing a lot of emotional stress and mental health that they report is actually keeping them from enrolling in the first place. So there are all these other things we have to solve for. But I think the good news is most Americans do believe that post-secondary education equals benefits above and beyond those just to the individual. They include things like that more engaged and informed citizenry that will really create a better workplace and a better society for all of us.
But here is that there are institutions closing. This isn't something we talk about a lot on the podcast, although we probably should, but when an institution closes, it's not just about the students, although that is our customer and that's where we put the focus, but we're talking about staff and faculty and a community and the jobs lost in the pipeline of employees that could be lost in that community because people decide they're not even going to go back to school after their institution closes. So the question becomes, what's happening right now? Is this fraying at the edges when it comes to school closures? Because many have been for-profit or small Catholic institutions or religiously affiliated institutions. Or is this a true thinning of the herd that's coming? We hear a poor planning, a financial sustainability, demographic cliff. What is truly happening in higher ed?
No pressure. Well, I will say, I think students are voting with their feet. And I think that's a positive thing in any market, right? That people have choice and they can choose specific institutions over others. And I think what a lot of them are saying is, I will go to this less expensive institution who offers good outcomes, maybe not as perfect outcomes as another institution, but strong outcomes because I can afford it, because I'm confident in the degree value long-term, and that's worth it.
Nailed it.
A private, not-for-profit institution, and you've been relying upon reputation alone, and you have not been innovating and changing how you reach and teach students, you have missed a really important opportunity. And I think you will probably pay for an enrollment. Absolutely. And I think that should be the case, right? Institutions should be held accountable for either their lack of innovation or their lack of fiduciary responsibility as it relates to the board you just described. And I think that's really positive, actually. And I think other institutions are coming out as winners in all of this, right? You look at Western Governors University, which is one of the fastest growing universities in our country. I would say that people have voted with their feet and they're choosing that institution because they are very transparent in the outcomes that they provide students. Those outcomes are strong and the cost is very low, and they're also flexible. The people that we interview who are not currently enrolled in post-secondary education say that they need a flexible experience. It can't be one in which they have to be in a butt in a seat 9 hours a day, 5 days a week on campus at a traditional institution. They want an opportunity to be able to work and learn at the same time. And they need that because they're a caregiver or they have additional familial responsibilities that keep them from being able to be a traditional, quote, 18 to 22-year-old college student we often consider when we consider college in general. So I think those institutions, the WGUs of the world, will win in this greater shakeup that's already happening and has happened over the course of the last 5 to 10 years. I think that's really positive for learners, by the way, because as those types of institutions are successful, it'll force other institutions to adopt some of those innovative practices that have currently met the market where it is, which is a different market, by the way, than it was 15 years ago. We talk about traditional and non-traditional age college students, and we act like traditional 18 to 22-year-olds are the majority of college students today. That's not the case anymore. It's actually the adult learner who is maybe 25 to 35 and returning to post-secondary education or enrolling for the first time. And they have very different needs than the 18 to 22-year-old we used to talk about 10 years ago, who is on campus in person and wants that residential traditional college experience. So I think institutions that can innovate to meet both types of students will be far more successful than those who won't.
That's a fact. That's a fact.
You know that the world of higher education is experiencing evolutions and revolutions. You want to be part of the progress. Commencement, the beginning of a new era in higher education with insights from more than 100 college and university presidents, will show you how. Get your copy of Commencement, the beginning of a new era in higher education now on Amazon right away. We think you're going to love it. It's
amazing.
So in the closure conversation, and this is an important one to me, certainly, in the closure conversation, how much of the challenge is that leadership or, on campuses is just not listening to their customer? I mean, you're a pollster, and so I'm curious how many campuses actually poll their customer or poll the people who chose not to attend?
That's a great question. I think far too few of institutions are actively surveying their currently enrolled students to understand a little bit more about where they're wrong and where they're strong, especially relative to competitors and others that are available within their immediate market. I think in terms of why some of these institutions are closing, I do think there's a crisis of leadership in higher education. You see this with the record low tenure rates of an average president, right? They're opting out of this experience for a reason. It's a very challenging job. I was speaking to one president a few years ago who said, I'm basically the mayor of a small town. I'm not just the president. Yikes! I have health services, I have residential experiences to consider, I have safety to consider. I also have that academic experience that everybody is actually talking about on a day-to-day basis. And I have to worry about all of those things in this ecosystem of this small town that I'm essentially running. It's an incredibly difficult job in any scenario, but certainly right now in our current environment, it's uniquely difficult. So I do think we have a lack of leadership at a lot of institutions. I also think we have a really toxic workplace at a lot of these institutions. Yikes! We haven't talked yet about faculty and staff employee engagement, but it's very low relative to other industries in which Gallup tracks. We've been tracking employee engagement for the better part of the last 40 plus years. And we find it's toxic for a variety of reasons. Burnout's very high among faculty and staff members, more so than really any other industry in which we track, except for K-12 teachers. They're the only group that's more burned out than faculty and staff. And that's, by the way, even in comparison to healthcare workers. They're even more burned out than healthcare workers after the course of the last few years. So that's pretty troubling. Burnout's very high, well-being's very low at the same time. And then you add to it concerns about diversity, equity, inclusion at many of these campuses. We see women, for example, are twice as likely if they're a faculty member within an institution as compared with all other industries to report they've been passed over due to their gender. That's a problem, right? Those of us who hold higher education to a higher standard feel like they should actually be the opposite, right? They should be far more likely to report that they haven't been passed over due to their gender. That the fact that they're double the national rate is really alarming. So this toxic workplace, And a lot of faculty members who are highly talented are leaving their institutions, not necessarily to go to other institutions, although of course there is a natural reshuffle that's happened within the market over the last few years, but they're leaving to go to other industries in which they feel like they'll be really valued, they'll have less stressors, and also importantly, institutions and organizations that really value the unique contributions that somebody who's passionate about teaching and reaching others can offer those institutions, which is voluminous. So I also think we have to consider the workplace here, especially when you consider, we talk so much about retention. How are we going to keep more students, retained at these institutions? We're obviously facing a really large number of those who have some college but no degree in this country. That's a problem. We have more students than ever that are enrolled that are at risk of not continuing and not completing on time. Faculty members who are highly talented and really engaged are essentially our frontline defense in this issue of student retention. They're those individuals that will keep a student from leaving the institution, going to another institution, or leaving higher education in general. And yet a record number of faculty members are not engaged or actively and toxically disengaged within their workplace. So they can't be that frontline defense if they themselves are really disengaged within their work.
Outrageous!
So I have a follow-up question to that, if it's okay, Joe. I currently work at the nation's preeminent executive search firm in higher education. We place more presidents than any other firm. And so as I'm doing that work, I'm curious what your counsel would be around how do we support these leaders moving into these really challenging roles? And also, how do we identify them? How do we identify the leaders that are equipped for the current moment?
Oh, it's a great question. It's such a challenging job, as I mentioned, for so many distinct reasons. And I would say it's gotten harder for sure in the last 5 to 10 years. I would say that leaders who are incredibly successful within their organization do a few things. I mean, certainly they inspire hope for the future within their faculty and staff population. They also communicate a consistency and a stability that I think is really important, especially right now for faculty and staff members. And they inspire confidence in their expertise as well. I mean, certainly to be a successful president, you have to, I think, believe in the mission of post-secondary education more generally, and absolutely be able to communicate that mission to your workforce. But I also think that you need to treat your students as customers, as you mentioned earlier, Melody. I think that's so important for an average president to consider, that students are voting with their feet and they do have incredible buying power as you consider their 4-year pathway within a traditional 4-year degree granting institution. And I think those presidents have to think differently about how they reach and teach those students. I also think they have to be somebody who just enjoys leading people. Sometimes we promote people within the workforce, and this isn't just true within higher education, this is true across all industries. We promote people based on how well they perform as individual contributors. So they're somebody who loves what they do, they are an individual faculty member who's incredibly successful in reaching and teaching students and publishing them. We say, don't you want to be provost? Don't you want to be president? That person might just be a really successful individual contributor and really be meant to be interacting on a day-to-day basis with students. That doesn't mean they're meant to be a president. In order to be a president, you really have to love leading and teaching and managing others. And not everyone does, and that's okay. We need to stop talking about advancement within organizations as if it's the only option is essentially to manage a team, because not everybody is meant to manage a team. In fact, Gallup science says that about basically 1 in 10 people have the natural talent to be a manager. And then 2 in 10 you can teach to be proficient in it. But essentially 7 in 10 should never manage a team of others. And so we have a lot of presidents who I think end up in this role because they were incredibly talented faculty members or provosts. And then they end up in the presidential role and they realize this is not at all what they envisioned and pictured and imagined and hoped for. And there are all these other responsibilities associated with their job that have to do with managing people and individuals that really isn't, at all in their talent bank.
I think what she's saying here is that if you or anyone wants to become a president, you better be ready.
Bullseye.
There are so many stakeholder groups that have an interest in decisions that you're going to make on a daily basis. This is a really hard job with multiple perspectives, multiple interests, and you have to be mentally ready to take this on. We talked to a president from a large public research university in the East Coast, on the East Coast of the US. And he said, remember like it was yesterday, he said, to be a college president, you have to be ready to walk away from the job at any time. You have to be ready to walk away because the job can't dominate you. You have to have that freedom that when it's time to walk away, you have to walk away. What do you think, Stephanie? Is this just a hard job these days?
Yeah, I think it's a really challenging political position to be in. And a lot of people didn't run for office for a reason. And now they're president of a university. And that's a really political position to be in, especially right now, especially if you're at a large public institution in states in which they're introducing new legislation that can often be at odds with faculty and staff members' perspectives of how the institution should be run. It's a very political position. And I do think that's why we're starting to see this higher turnover than we've ever seen before.
I'm curious, Stephanie, you mentioned early on in the conversation the intersection between political persuasion or ideology and decision making. I wonder if you could tease that out a little bit more for us.
Yeah, so in some of our more recent research in partnership with Lumina Foundation, we asked individuals, those who were currently enrolled, as well as prospective students, the extent to which political laws and a specific state would impact their enrollment decisions. We were really interested in particular about how recent laws surrounding reproductive health care, access and rights within specific states might influence whether or not somebody wanted to go and learn within that state. We also asked similar questions around DE&I policies. Obviously, at the time, there was a series of legislation being introduced, and now even more so, more has actually been introduced since we surveyed, that has essentially impacted what faculty and staff members are allowed to instruct about and discuss with their students. And we wanted to understand the extent to which those policies were also influencing enrollment decisions among prospective and currently enrolled students. And what we found in that research is conservative and liberal students alike both reported that those policies were really important to their decision-making about where they would enroll at a specific institution and whether or not they would stay enrolled at a specific institution. And when we asked if those laws should be made more strict or actually relaxed within those states in order for them to feel more comfortable enrolling in that institution, conservative and liberal students alike reported that they wanted less restrictive or reproductive healthcare access laws in that specific state. And they also wanted faculty and members to be able to instruct on these divisive topics in those states. So in both cases, we found that all types of students essentially agreed that they wanted less restrictive reproductive health care and also less restrictions on what faculty and staff members were allowed to instruct on and interact with students. As we talk about this enrollment crisis that we're currently within, and what I think is probably looming over the next 5 to 10 years based on current predictions, I think some states are going to win and lose in this battle. I think some states who make their reproductive health care laws in their state less restrictive and reproductive health care access more available to students, I think they will win out over states who are introducing more of these laws. Now, obviously, more is to be seen on that front, but based on how important it is to prospective students, I would expect us to see some enrollment implication for large university systems in states in which these policies have been introduced.
I'm curious if you have data yet about how ideology is going to sort out executives and whether you've done that research yet. As an executive search professional, I'm curious to know whether we'll see a similar voting with feet among deans and provosts and cabinet members at institutions in various states.
I have no quantitative data on that yet, but I wish I did because I'm really curious about that. I do think that faculty and staff members are going to be reflecting upon some of the policies being introduced in their state and wondering to what extent is their job at risk long-term, just like all of us do, right? So we all have a regular calculation we do about the stability of our job, just how long we plan to stay there, regardless of industry. If you are in a state in which these new laws are continuously being introduced, you feel inherently less stable than somebody who's in another state in which those laws are not being introduced. I think that's just natural. So I do think that could absolutely have an impact, not just on whether or not somebody stays or leaves, but also their engagement within their job. Because if you feel like your job is at risk, because you do tend to teach in maybe a field in which there's more controversy associated with it, you're probably going to feel less comfortable on a day-to-day basis. If you're less comfortable, you're probably going to be less engaged in the work that you're doing with students. And obviously there continue to be implications associated with that. So I do worry that there will be a brain drain at some of these institutions. And unfortunately, they'll lose some of their more talented faculty and staff members who can go to another institution and have the ability to do so and are very attractive candidates. So they're not going to lose their least engaged, less successful faculty and staff members. They're going to lose their best talent, unfortunately.
I'm glad you mentioned students as consumers, because, this is like my favorite topic as we talk about this in higher education. I did my dissertation on student consumerism, and I looked at psychological contracts as the theoretical framework, as in, psychological contracts are something that we have with an employer. We are going to provide services. The employer provides services to us. And when that unspoken bond is broken, people leave their jobs. And the same applies to us as students and students as a consumer. When you go and you buy your education, you expect some level of service. And that level of service is highly evolved from where it used to be. And when the institution doesn't deliver, the student leaves. And it's that and their ability to become as transient as they want, and other institutions willing to pick up those credits, that makes this just 24/7 on-demand customer service piece of our business so important.
Right. And I don't have to go to the institution in my state, right? I can go to a fully owned institution and never move, right? I never have to leave my house. I can have that complete experience from my own office, my living room, my dining room, wherever I choose to learn, and probably at a lower price point. So I do think that I think that's positive in some ways, because it's forced institutions to reflect upon the value that they're providing. Now, if you're an elite institution, you might say, we still provide a higher, more valuable experience. But I think you have to prove that now in a way that you didn't have to 15 years ago. And I think that's really positive. When we look at the relationship, by the way, on things like whether or not my degree is worth the cost, this really important subjective rating that we ask individual consumers, we see that there's not this very one-to-one relationship with how well your institution is ranked. Now, if your institution is ranked extremely high in that, top 10, top 15 institutions nationally, even top 25 via US News and World Report, you will see a slight lift in the percentage of those students who report their degree was, quote, worth the cost. But once you move beyond the top 25 institutions and you look at the next, 26 through 100 in that US News and World Report ranking, you essentially get no lift in the percent of students who report their, quote, degree was worth the cost. So a higher ranking or rating does not necessarily equivalent to more value, at least from the perspective of the currently enrolled student who's experiencing that education. And I would argue even upon graduation, we don't see that traditional lift that most people would experience or expect from an alumni point of view. So higher ranking rating does not equal higher value for most students. And I would argue that's probably because if you're in that 26 to 100, you have a more equivalent experience and you're still paying a pretty significant cost associated with that degree. So it's a good reminder to prospective students as to really not where you go, it's how you go. If you go to an institution that's ranked 15 or 16 versus 25, but that institution that's ranked 25 provides you a high quality internship, allows you to apply what you were learning in the classroom, a mentor, you feel cared for as a person, you're actually going to see a far greater return on investment than the student who went to the institution that was ranked number 15.
Nailed it.
Totally unseen and unimportant. And I say that because I went to an institution like Elon that really prides itself in high quality experiential learning and activities. And I experienced all of the great, quote, big six experiences Gallup reports are incredibly important to long-term value from an alumni perspective. It wasn't the highest ranking institution that I applied to, but it was an institution that cared for and was really invested in me as a learner, and I made more out of it.
And that's, of course, assuming that an institution is still on the ranking list, which seems to be changing.
Well, so Stephanie, you mentioned the big six. Can you tell us what they are?
Yeah, so we asked a series of questions in our currently enrolled student surveys and our alumni surveys that we know are really important to outcomes upon graduation, things like higher employee engagement, higher well-being. 3 of the items are in the area of support, emotional support, and 3 are in the area of experiential learning activities. So in the case of support, we asked the extent to which students had mentors who encouraged them to pursue their goals and dreams. We asked whether or not they felt cared for as a person while enrolled. We also ask about things like extreme activity and extracurricular activities in organizations, deep investment in their community around them. We also ask the extent to which they were able to take advantage of internship opportunities that allow them to apply what they were learning in the classroom. And we also ask about whether or not they took part in a project or an activity that took them a semester or more to complete. And what we find is across these 6 items that we measure is that people are far more likely to be thriving upon graduation if they experience these 6. They're also far more likely to be engaged in their work upon graduation. And of course, one of our theories around that is if you had a really great mentor, if you had a really great internship while you were enrolled, you were often experimenting with a career pathway that allowed you to be a little bit smarter about what you wanted to do upon graduation. So of course, there's so many reasons that each of these individual experiences are really important to students once they graduate. But we find that, where you went in terms of, top 100, elite, non-elite, more selective, less selective, we actually don't see a huge impact on those big 6, which tells us that it's more about the programmatic decision-making of those institutions, just to what extent they promote things like caring about students as people, right? The students aren't just butts and seats, but they're actually seen as individuals to the professors who interact with them. So we know it's a programmatic decision on behalf of a lot of these institutions to actually create an experience where students really have these opportunities. And of course, to our earlier points on where you go, it's how you go. We don't see a big difference in typology of institutions. So public versus private, not-for-profit, we don't see a big difference. Now, for-profits do tend to fare worse on many of those metrics, but among the not-for-profit institutions, we don't see a big difference. So it's a good reminder that people should be a little less focused, I think, on the ranking or the rating of a specific school or the typology or the Carnegie code or classification for a specific school. You should be far more focused on what do the faculty value? Do they enjoy interacting with students, or do they just like publishing, which is absolutely fine, but might not make for a high quality student experience for all students.
Stephanie, you give us some amazing numbers, and I got to ask, do you sleep at night, or are you just running like 2-way ANOVAs all night long?
I do sleep at night, but I feel like there's a Jeopardy edition that I'm missing out on that would just have weird idiosyncratic statistics that people don't really need, but maybe they want to know. And I feel like that would be my game.
I would absolutely love for you to design that and bring it to the EdUp experience. We could do it here live, a Jeopardy edition. That would be fantastic. But a conversation for another day. Stephanie, our first question before we get you out of here, what else do you want to say about Gallup that needs to be said?
Yeah, so we have so many great insights on our website that many people don't even realize are made publicly available. You can download our reports. We encourage people to subscribe to those newsletters to constantly get new insights. If you go to news.gallup.com, you'll find a continuous array of stories and articles in education and other industries in which we're actively measuring. So I always encourage people to go to that website. We have so many more insights available, and of course more is coming. We have some really interesting releases coming this fall in partnership with Lumina Foundation about Americans' attitudes towards post-secondary education, what kinds of outcomes they think are associated with a post-secondary degree or credential. So stay tuned, more to come.
Okay, Stephanie, here it is. What do you see for the future of higher education?
No pressure at all. Well, I wish I had a crystal ball and I could see 10 to 15 years from now, but I would say, I think we should expect less change than we probably need. I actually think institutions are very slow to evolve. And I think, sometimes that's a good thing, right? That there's more deliberation and consideration before making a seismic change. But I think in this case, higher education needs to evolve more quickly than it has in the past. I think 10 years from now will look very similar to current day. We'll probably have more options for non-traditional adult learners, which will be great because we have more of them than ever before, and we need to provide them more pathways. I think we'll have more instances in which people are working and learning at the same time, which will be great for our workforce as well. And I think we'll probably have a lot of institutions that do consolidate and end up being purchased by other institutions. And I think that's great too. I think the market will shake out appropriately in that regard. And institutions that are refusing to evolve and holding on tightly to traditional approaches to reaching and teaching students, and who aren't transparent about the value that they provide students, will fail, as they should. And I hope that means that we'll have more options for an average American.
Wow, I love that. Melody, what did you think about this conversation?
I think it's fascinating, and I'm really glad that you're providing data to a really difficult moment in higher education so that we can make wise choices as we go.
Yeah, I mean, I think those of us who work in this field, I will say, I think we do so because we believe in the promise of post-secondary education. I was a first-generation college student. My mother was a house cleaner. My father was a produce delivery person, and they believed deeply in the value of post-secondary education. They made it clear to me there was really only one option. My mother made it very clear that I was to get a college degree, and she really believed in it. And I think that is one of the only levers we have for economic mobility in this country, unfortunately. So I still believe in the promise of it. We just need to make that promise available to more students, I think.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our episode, but I want to outro our amazing, outstanding, incredible guest co-host today. You know her, you love her. Her name is Dr. Melody Rose, and she's a principal at Whitkeeper. Great to have you with us, Melody. It's just an honor having you here.
I'll be back with you, Joe. Thanks for the invite.
And of course, my guest today, your guest today, here she is. She is Stephanie Marken. She is a partner at Gallup. Stephanie, did you have a good time on the podcast today?
I had a great time. The noise effects, the sound effects were an added benefit. It was wonderful. Thanks so much for having me.
You know what I'm going to say, don't you? Here it is. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just EdUp'd. It's time to level up. The beginning of a new era in higher education begins with you. Order your copy of Commencement, The Beginning of a New Era in Higher Education by Kate Colbert, Dr. Joseph Lucio, with contributions by Elvin Freitas. It's higher education's must-read book of 2022. Discover how you can seize the moment to change higher education forever. Commencement, The Beginning of a New Era in Higher Education, now available on Amazon. For bulk orders, contact Kate, Joe, or Elvin.